The Israelite tribes, emerging from a period of nomadic existence, began their slow and arduous settlement of the land of Canaan. This was not a unified, rapid conquest of a vacant land, but a gradual and often difficult process of infiltration into a region already populated by a complex array of established, resilient cultures. The primary area of Israelite settlement was the rugged, defensible terrain of the Central Highlands, a stark contrast to the fertile plains and valleys below, which were already firmly in the hands of more technologically advanced powers. But there is much more to the history of Israel than this. What forced the future King David to seek refuge in the court of his most hated enemy, the Philistines? How did the very policies that built King Solomon's legendary wealth also lead to the kingdom's tragic collapse? How did a nation's monopoly on a single material give them the power to nearly destroy an entire kingdom? The political landscape of late Bronze Age and early Iron Age Canaan was a fragmented mosaic of rival city-states. Cities such as Shechem, Hebron, and Jerusalem were fortified strongholds, each with its own king, army, and patron deities. The inhabitants, including groups like the Jebusites, Hivites, and Amorites, were not easily displaced. They possessed centuries-old agricultural and urban traditions, and their control over vital trade routes and water sources gave them a decided advantage. The Israelites, lacking a central government, a standing army, or sophisticated iron weaponry, relied instead on their knowledge of the mountainous terrain and a fierce, shared identity forged through their covenant with Yahweh. This era was defined by a delicate balance of coexistence and conflict. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Israelite tribes often settled in unoccupied hill country, gradually expanding their presence and sometimes clashing with the Canaanite populations in the valleys below. When conflicts arose, the decentralized nature of the tribes meant that victory was never assured. The enemy forces, often equipped with iron chariots and superior arms, posed a significant threat to the Israelite infantry. Without a central authority to rally the 12 tribes, each victory was a local achievement, and each defeat was a devastating blow that could plunge a single tribe into subjugation. This turbulent dawn of a new people created a unique social structure. Lacking a king or a central capital, governance was largely in the hands of clan elders and local leaders. The nation was bound together not by political allegiance, but by a shared religious identity and a communal heritage passed down through generations. This loose confederacy, while resilient in its adaptability, was perpetually vulnerable to external threats. Just a quick announcement: if you enjoy this video so far, please subscribe to our channel, as it motivates us to bring you a new story every evening. This is the only kind request tonight, and we won't bother you with it anymore until the very end of today's story. Let's get back to the video. As the coastal Philistines, a seafaring people with a near monopoly on iron technology, began their inexorable expansion, the very existence of the Israelite tribes would be tested. Their decentralized form of government, once a source of strength, would eventually prove to be a weakness, paving the way for a desperate cry for a new, more powerful form of leadership. The period following the initial Israelite settlement in Canaan is often referred to as the era of the Judges, a transitional epoch characterized by a power vacuum and a cyclical pattern of decline and revival. With no centralized government or hereditary king, the tribes existed as a loose confederacy, bound by a shared religious identity, but largely autonomous in their local affairs. This decentralized political structure left them perpetually vulnerable to the more organized and militarily sophisticated city-states and foreign powers that surrounded them. The historical accounts of this period, compiled centuries later, reveal a recurring pattern. First, a generation would forget the covenant with Yahweh and adopt the religious practices of their Canaanite neighbors. This spiritual apostasy would, according to the narratives, lead to divine retribution in the form of oppression by a foreign power, such as the Moabites, Ammonites, or Philistines. In their desperation, the people would cry out for help, and a charismatic leader, a judge, would be raised up to deliver them. These judges were not judicial figures in the modern sense, but rather military saviors and temporary, divinely inspired chieftains. The judges' authority was limited and non-hereditary. Their influence rarely extended beyond their own tribe, or a coalition of a few tribes for a specific campaign. The stories of figures like Deborah, a prophetess who led the tribes of Zebulun and Naphtali to victory against the Canaanites, or Gideon, who famously defeated the Midianites with a small hand-picked force, illustrate the localized nature of their power. Their leadership was a personal, charismatic phenomenon that provided a temporary peace for a generation. This inherent instability created constant internal and external friction. The tribes frequently fell into disputes with one another, as seen in the brutal intertribal conflict with the tribe of Benjamin. Meanwhile, the most persistent external threat came from the Philistines. Their presence was not a passing raid, but a continuous pressure on Israelite territories from the coastal plain. With their advanced iron technology for both weaponry and agriculture, the Philistines maintained a significant military and economic advantage. The Israelites, reliant on bronze and lacking the knowledge to forge iron, found themselves at a constant disadvantage, a fact that exacerbated the social and political fragility of the era. This chronic state of disunity and external threat ultimately highlighted the severe shortcomings of the judges' system. The people yearned for a more permanent and powerful form of government that could provide lasting security, setting the stage for the dramatic and often contentious demand for a king. The arrival of the Philistines marked a new and critical phase in the history of the Israelite tribes. Identified by historians as one of the Sea Peoples who migrated from the Aegean region, they established a powerful and enduring presence along the southern coastal plain of Canaan. Their 5 primary city-states, Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gath, and Ekron, formed a formidable political and military confederation that operated with a unified strategy, a stark contrast to the scattered and uncoordinated Israelite tribes. This organized structure, combined with their superior technology, allowed them to exert a relentless and expanding pressure on the Israelite settlements in the highlands. The Philistines held a decisive technological advantage that gave them military and economic supremacy, their near monopoly on iron forging. While the Israelite tribes were still largely reliant on bronze for their tools and weapons, the Philistine blacksmiths had mastered the more advanced and durable technology of iron. This technological gap was a defining feature of the era. Philistine armies were equipped with stronger iron swords, spears, and chariots, which were highly effective in the flat, open terrain of the plains. The Israelite farmers and warriors, by contrast, fought with less effective bronze tools and were often outmatched in direct confrontation. This disparity was not accidental. Historical evidence indicates the Philistines actively suppressed the knowledge and practice of ironsmithing among the Israelite population, ensuring their continued military dominance and economic control. The Philistine presence was not a series of fleeting raids, but an existential threat that challenged the very fabric of Israelite life. They controlled the most fertile agricultural lands and the vital trade routes that ran along the coast, effectively stifling Israelite economic growth. This military and economic pressure had profound consequences. It led to the subjugation of numerous Israelite communities and, in a pivotal moment of the era, the destruction of the central Israelite sanctuary at Shiloh. This catastrophic event, which saw the Philistines capture the Ark of the Covenant, demonstrated the fragility of the Israelite religious and social institutions and the undeniable military might of their enemies. The constant fear of Philistine expansion and the humiliation of their defeats created a collective anxiety that would ultimately push the Israelite people to seek a radical change in their political and social order. The central Israelite sanctuary at Shiloh, established during the initial settlement of Canaan, was meant to be the spiritual and political heart of the tribal confederacy. For generations, it served as the dwelling place for the Ark of the Covenant, the most sacred object of Israelite faith, and the site for major religious festivals and judicial pronouncements. However, as the era of the judges wore on, the institution faced a profound internal crisis rooted in the moral decay of its priestly line. The corruption of the high priest Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas, cast a long shadow over the sanctuary and ultimately contributed to the weakening of the entire nation. Hophni and Phinehas are depicted in the historical record as flagrantly abusing their priestly authority. Their transgressions were not merely minor infractions, but a systematic subversion of the very laws they were meant to uphold. They are accused of seizing the best portions of sacrificial offerings for themselves, taking the meat before it could be properly prepared for ritual consumption. This act was a direct violation of established religious law and a profound insult to the people who brought their sacrifices. The priests' actions deprived the worshippers of their sacred portion and undermined the integrity of the sacrificial system, a cornerstone of Israelite religious practice. Beyond their ritual abuses, the sons of Eli were also accused of profound moral failings that extended into the social sphere. They were said to have engaged in illicit sexual relations with the women who served at the sanctuary entrance, transforming the holy space into a place of profanity and desecration. These acts of spiritual and moral corruption were not hidden from the public. The narrative explicitly states that their sin was very great in the sight of the people. This public scandal eroded the faith of the population and demonstrated a clear breakdown of moral authority at the highest levels of the religious establishment. Despite being aware of his son's behavior, the high priest Eli's response was weak and ineffectual. He offered only mild rebukes, failing to take decisive action to remove them from their positions or to restore the sanctity of the sanctuary. This failure of leadership and accountability had severe consequences. The scandal at Shiloh did more than just alienate the people. It invited a theological and political crisis. The narrative suggests that their corruption was an affront to divine law that would lead to a catastrophic outcome. When the Philistines finally attacked, the moral and spiritual rot at the heart of Shiloh left the people unprepared and vulnerable. The sanctuary's destruction and the capture of the ark were seen as both a military defeat and a divinely sanctioned punishment for the very corruption that the priestly line had come to embody. The spiritual and political void left by the corruption at Shiloh and the growing threat of the Philistines set the stage for the emergence of a new kind of leader, the prophet Samuel. Born in a period of profound national distress, Samuel's life would bridge the turbulent era of the judges with the establishment of the unified monarchy. His birth narrative, centered on a barren mother's prayer and a miraculous divine response, established his prophetic authority from his earliest years. He was raised at the sanctuary in Shiloh under the tutelage of the high priest Eli, and his youth was marked by a direct, personal relationship with the divine that contrasted sharply with the moral failings of his mentors. Samuel's prophetic calling is depicted as a direct intervention, a voice in the night that called to him as a young boy. This encounter established him as a legitimate prophet, whose words were seen as a direct communication from the divine, not merely a human interpretation. After the destruction of Shiloh and the capture of the ark, Samuel rose to prominence as a spiritual leader, traveling through the various Israelite territories to teach, arbitrate disputes, and restore the people's focus on their covenant. His ministry marked a critical shift, moving the center of religious authority from a fixed, corruptible sanctuary to the person of a dedicated prophet. As the final and most influential of the judges, Samuel's role was multifaceted. He was a military leader who guided the Israelites to a decisive, if temporary, victory over the Philistines at Mizpah, an event that provided a brief respite from the constant threat. More importantly, he was a political unifier and a moral compass for a fragmented people. His authority was not based on military might or hereditary claims, but on his spiritual integrity and the perception that he spoke on behalf of the divine. This made him a unifying force for the disparate tribes, who were accustomed to following charismatic leaders for limited periods. The zenith of Samuel's power coincided with a period of intense public anxiety. The chronic threat of the Philistines and the perceived failure of the judges' system convinced the people that their decentralized government was no longer viable. In their desperation, the elders of Israel came to Samuel and demanded a king, a permanent ruler who would lead them in battle and govern them like the other nations. This request, while rooted in a legitimate fear of Philistine dominance, was seen by Samuel as a rejection of their divine ruler. Yet it was through this very demand that Samuel's final and most pivotal act of leadership would come. He would reluctantly, yet dutifully, guide the Israelites through the tumultuous transition from a tribal confederacy to a unified monarchy, anointing their first two kings and establishing the foundation for a new era of Israelite history. The period of Samuel's leadership, while providing a degree of spiritual and military stability, coincided with a growing and palpable sense of anxiety among the Israelite tribes. The chronic threat of Philistine expansion, which had already led to the destruction of Shiloh and the subjugation of numerous communities, highlighted a fundamental weakness in the Israelite political structure. The decentralized ad hoc system of the judges, with its reliance on temporary charismatic leaders, was proving to be an inadequate response to a highly organized, technologically superior enemy. This pervasive fear of military and political annihilation gave rise to a desperate collective demand for a radical change in governance. The elders of Israel, acting as spokesmen for the people, converged on Samuel in his old age and presented their unambiguous request: "Appoint for us a king to govern us like all the nations." This demand was rooted in a practical military and political calculus. The Philistines, with their centralized monarchy, standing army, and advanced iron weaponry, were a model of effectiveness that the Israelites could not replicate under their current system. The people believed that a king, a permanent and singular head of state, would be able to unite the disparate tribes, raise a national army, and provide the long-term security that had eluded them for generations. Samuel, however, viewed this request with profound dismay. To him, the demand for a king was not merely a political decision, it was a theological rejection. The Israelite covenant with Yahweh was unique among the nations, as it established a direct relationship between the divine and the people, without the need for an intermediary human monarch. The narratives present Samuel's perspective that the people were essentially rejecting their divine ruler in favor of an earthly one. He warned them of the consequences of this choice, describing the heavy burdens of monarchy: conscription for military service, taxation to support a royal court, and the appropriation of land and property for the king's family and officials. He painted a picture of a king who would ultimately exploit the very people he was meant to protect. Despite Samuel's dire warnings, the people were unyielding in their demand. Their desire for a king was driven by a deep-seated fear of their enemies and a pragmatic longing for national cohesion and security. They saw the judges' system as a failure and were willing to accept the potential hardships of a monarchy. in exchange for the promise of military deliverance. This unanimous insistence forced Samuel into a difficult position. As a prophet, he could not simply ignore the will of the people, even if he disagreed with their motivations. He would be compelled, by divine instruction, to reluctantly initiate the process of transitioning the tribes from a tribal confederacy to a unified monarchy, anointing their first king and forever changing the course of Israelite history. Following the insistent demands of the people, the prophet Samuel was tasked with anointing a king for Israel. This selection process was not a political election, but a divinely guided search, culminating in the unlikely choice of Saul, a man from the small and traditionally insignificant tribe of Benjamin. Saul's background was not that of a military commander or a wealthy aristocrat, but that of a humble farmer who was, according to the narrative, searching for his father's lost donkeys when he first encountered the prophet. This initial meeting, seemingly by chance, underscored the divine and non-political nature of his selection. Saul's physical stature was his most notable attribute. He is described as being a head taller than any other man in Israel, a quality that, in an ancient society, was often equated with leadership and authority. This impressive physical presence, a key factor in winning the approval of a people who desired a king like all the nations, offered a visual and psychological counterpoint to the towering Philistine warriors. In an era of constant warfare, a leader who looked the part, a man of imposing height and strength, was a powerful symbol of hope and defiance against their enemies. However, Saul's anointing was not a simple or public affair. He was anointed in secret by Samuel, a private act that was followed by a public, if not entirely successful, reveal. During a national assembly, Saul was chosen by lot, an act meant to demonstrate divine approval. Yet, at this critical moment, Saul was found hiding among the baggage, a detail that highlights his initial humility, reluctance, and lack of political ambition. He was not a man who sought power, but one who had it thrust upon him. This initial humility would be a defining characteristic of his early reign, a stark contrast to the pride and paranoia that would later consume him. The true test of his leadership came shortly after his public anointing. The Ammonites, a neighboring enemy, laid siege to the city of Jabesh-Gilead, threatening its inhabitants with a brutal fate. Upon hearing the news, a spontaneous transformation occurred in Saul. The narratives describe the Spirit of God rushing upon him, which galvanized him into action. He rallied a national army, an achievement that none of the judges had accomplished, and led them to a decisive victory over the Ammonites. This military success was the crucial moment that legitimized Saul's kingship in the eyes of the people. His ability to unite the tribes, raise an army, and secure a victory proved that the choice of a king had been a pragmatic and necessary step toward national security. He was no longer just the anointed of the prophet. He was the proven military leader of the people. The anointing of Saul by the prophet Samuel, while symbolically important, did not immediately grant him political authority over the 12 tribes. Lacking a standing army, a centralized administration, or a capital city, his kingship was an abstract concept that required a decisive event to prove its practical value. This crucial moment came with the siege of Jabesh-Gilead by the Ammonites under their king, Nahash. This was not a minor border skirmish, but a systematic military operation that threatened the city with a brutal fate. The Ammonite terms of surrender the gouging out of the right eye of every male inhabitant were a calculated act of humiliation and a military tactic designed to make the population unfit for warfare, sending a message to all of Israel about the futility of resistance. The news of the siege and the impending mutilation of Jabesh-Gilead's citizens was the catalyst that transformed Saul from a reluctant farmer into a proven leader. The biblical narrative describes a spontaneous supernatural event in which the Spirit of God rushed upon him, galvanizing him with a righteous fury. This event can be interpreted as the psychological awakening of his martial spirit, a moment where his inherent physical strength was paired with a clear sense of purpose. This was a critical legitimizing factor. His authority was no longer based solely on Samuel's anointing, but on a palpable, divinely sanctioned call to action. Saul's method for rallying the tribes was both primitive and highly effective. He butchered a pair of oxen, cut them into 12 pieces, and sent the parts throughout the territories of Israel with the message that anyone who failed to answer his call to arms would see the same fate befall their livestock. This powerful and visceral ultimatum resonated with a population that understood both the language of blood oaths and the economic importance of their herds. The response was unprecedented. The tribes, which had previously struggled to unite under the judges, rallied to Saul's banner in a national mobilization, converging on the city of Bezek. Saul's subsequent military strategy demonstrated a nascent tactical brilliance. He divided his army into 3 divisions and launched a surprise dawn attack on the unprepared Ammonite camp. The coordinated assault resulted in a complete rout of the enemy forces, lifting the siege and rescuing the people of Jabesh-Gilead from their impending doom. This victory was a defining moment for the fledgling kingdom. It provided the first real demonstration of the monarchy's value and solidified Saul's authority in the eyes of the people. His military success proved that a centralized king could indeed unify the tribes and provide the security they had demanded, thereby transitioning his kingship from an abstract prophecy to a concrete, respected reality. The early years of Saul's kingship were marked by decisive military victories and growing popular support. However, his reign also saw the emergence of a fundamental rift between his authority and the prophetic power of Samuel. This conflict was not a personal feud, but a struggle over the very nature of the monarchy and the balance of power between the king and the divine. The first major clash between the 2 leaders occurred during a military campaign against the Philistines. The Israelites had rallied to Saul at Gilgal, but were terrified by the overwhelming size of the Philistine army and the demoralizing lack of iron weaponry among the Israelite forces. As the people began to scatter in fear, Saul found himself in a precarious position. Samuel, who was meant to arrive and offer the necessary pre-battle sacrifices, was delayed. Facing a disintegrating army in the Philistine advance, Saul took it upon himself to perform the sacrifice. This act was a profound violation of established religious protocol. In Israelite society, the offering of sacrifices was the exclusive domain of the priesthood and prophets, not a king. Saul's action, while perhaps motivated by pragmatic concerns of maintaining morale, was seen as a usurpation of Samuel's authority and a direct infringement on the divine-human relationship. It demonstrated a king who was willing to prioritize his own judgment over the clear instructions of the prophet, signaling a dangerous precedent for the new monarchy. Upon his arrival, Samuel confronted Saul with a fierce rebuke, stating that because he had acted foolishly and not kept the divine command, his dynasty would not last. The prophet's words were an ominous warning that the kingship was conditional, contingent on obedience and humility. The episode at Gilgal revealed Saul's fatal flaw, an impetuousness and a desire to consolidate both military and religious authority in his own hands. This conflict was not merely a disagreement between 2 men. It was a foundational struggle over the identity of the kingdom. Would it be a monarchy ruled by a human king who answered only to his own judgment, or a theocratic monarchy where the king's authority was subordinate to divine law as interpreted by a prophet? The second major instance of disobedience occurred during a campaign against the Amalekites, where Saul was instructed to utterly destroy the enemy and all their possessions. Instead, Saul spared the Amalekite king, Agag, and kept the best of the livestock for himself and his army. justifying his actions as a tribute to the divine. Samuel, in a final and decisive act of prophetic judgment, rejected Saul's offerings, declaring that to obey is better than sacrifice. This act solidified the rift, and Samuel, in a dramatic gesture, never saw Saul again, leaving the king to govern in a state of political and spiritual isolation. The growing rift between King Saul and the prophet Samuel left the king in a state of political and spiritual isolation. With his divine mandate questioned and his dynasty imperiled, Saul's authority, once a source of strength, became a source of profound insecurity. This psychological decline was exacerbated by the emergence of a new figure whose popularity and military prowess would begin to eclipse the king's own achievements. This individual was David, a young shepherd from Bethlehem, whose rise to prominence would cast a long shadow of jealousy over Saul's court. David's initial entry into Saul's court was due to his musical talent. When the king was tormented by a spirit of madness, his servant suggested finding a skilled lyre player to soothe his troubled mind. David, already known for his musical gifts, was brought to the palace. His music proved effective, and he earned a place in the king's inner circle, serving as his armor-bearer and musician. This close proximity to the king allowed him to learn the intricacies of court life and military command, skills that would prove crucial later in his life. However, it was not David's music, but his military success that cemented his fame and ignited Saul's paranoia. The most pivotal event was his single-handed defeat of the Philistine giant, Goliath. This was not merely a victory in a battle, but a symbolic and psychological triumph that resonated deeply with the terrified Israelite populace. With a single stone from his sling, David had achieved what the entire army, including the towering King Saul, had been too afraid to attempt. This act of courage instantly transformed him from a court musician into a national hero, with the populace chanting that Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. This public adulation was a direct challenge to Saul's authority and fragile ego. The king's military victories, once celebrated as triumphs for the nation, now paled in comparison to the exploits of a young shepherd. Saul began to view David not as a loyal subject, but as a dangerous rival for the throne. He appointed David to lead his armies, a position that only led to more military successes and greater public acclaim. David in turn demonstrated a shrewd understanding of military tactics and a natural ability to command loyalty, qualities that further intensified Saul's fear and jealousy. The king's mind, already tormented by madness and spiritual isolation, became consumed with a singular obsession to eliminate the rising star who posed an existential threat to his rule and his dynasty. The military standoff between the Israelite and Philistine armies in the Valley of Elah was a textbook example of the technological and psychological warfare of the era. The Philistines, with their superior iron weaponry, refused to engage in a conventional, full-scale battle, a move that would have likely resulted in their victory, but would also have entailed significant casualties. Instead, they employed a common military strategy of the time, single combat between two champions. Their champion, Goliath of Gath, was a figure of immense physical stature and a symbol of Philistine dominance. The narratives describe him as being armored in bronze and wielding a massive iron spear, a physical representation of the Philistine technological advantage that held the Israelite army in a state of paralyzing fear for 40 days. It was into this atmosphere of terror and demoralization that David, a young shepherd, arrived on the battlefield to deliver provisions to his elder brothers. His presence was entirely circumstantial, yet his response to the Philistine taunts was a pivotal moment in the conflict. He was a non-combatant, lacking armor and a sword, but he possessed an expert skill with a sling, a common but deadly tool used by shepherds to ward off predators. His refusal to wear the heavy and unfamiliar armor of King Saul was a rejection of the traditional military model that had proven ineffective against the Philistine champion. The battle between David and Goliath was not a mythological clash of equals, but a tactical engagement that exploited a fundamental weakness in the Philistines' strategy. Goliath, a heavy infantryman, was an impressive figure in close-quarters combat, but he was vulnerable at a distance. David, a skirmisher, used his superior speed and range to his advantage. The sling, in the hands of a skilled operator, was a devastating projectile weapon capable of firing a stone at speeds of over 60 miles per hour with pinpoint accuracy. The stone struck Goliath on the forehead, the one part of his body unprotected by his heavy bronze helmet. The impact was enough to incapacitate the giant, causing him to fall face down to the ground. The aftermath of this single combat was as significant as the battle itself. David, using Goliath's own sword-potent symbol of turning the enemy's strength against them, killed the giant and presented his head to the Israelite army. This act shattered the Philistines' psychological dominance. Their champion, the very embodiment of their military might, lay dead. Seeing this, the Philistine army broke ranks and fled, leading to a decisive Israelite victory. David's triumph was an immediate and profound turning point. He was no longer just a musician in the king's court. He was a national hero whose courage and tactical prowess had delivered the people from a threat that had paralyzed them for generations. This instant fame, however, would plant the first seeds of profound insecurity and jealousy in the heart of King Saul. The immediate aftermath of David's victory over Goliath was a period of immense public adulation for the young hero. But for King Saul, it initiated a profound psychological and political crisis. With his divine mandate in question and his authority increasingly challenged, Saul's mind began to unravel. The historical narrative attributes this decline to an evil spirit from the divine, a phrase that can be interpreted in modern terms as a state of deep depression, paranoid delusion, and madness. This mental state was not a private affliction. It had direct and devastating consequences for the stability of the kingdom. The primary catalyst for Saul's paranoia was his acute jealousy of David. The people's chant, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands," was a direct challenge to his authority and a public declaration that his successor had arrived. Saul, whose legitimacy was fragile from the start, saw in David not a loyal servant, but an existential threat to his throne and his family's dynastic aspirations. Every military victory and every instance of public praise directed at David was interpreted by the king as a step toward his own downfall. Saul's madness manifested in a series of increasingly irrational and violent actions against David. Initially, he attempted to kill David with a spear while the young man was playing his lyre to soothe him. This spontaneous violence escalated into a systematic campaign to eliminate his rival. Saul offered David his daughter Michal in marriage, but with the expectation that the dowry would be 100 Philistine foreskins, a mission he believed would lead to David's death in battle. When David returned victorious, Saul was forced to honor his word, but the plot only solidified David's position in the royal family and made him an even greater threat in the king's eyes. The king's final, desperate phase of his unraveling involved open and public attempts on David's life. He began to send assassins to David's home and openly pursued him across the land with a full military force. This campaign of political murder and persecution not only failed to eliminate David, but it also alienated Saul's own family and key military leaders. His son Jonathan, who was a close friend of David, acted as an intermediary, and his daughter Michal saved David's life, demonstrating that Saul's madness had created profound divisions within his own court. Saul's descent into paranoia left the kingdom in a state of chaos. with its military resources diverted from the Philistine threat and its leadership consumed by a single self-destructive obsession. The escalation of Saul's paranoia transformed his reign from a period of military triumph into a protracted and chaotic civil war. The king, consumed by his obsession with David, devoted the full resources of his fledgling kingdom to a relentless and systematic hunt for his rival. This was not a secret campaign. Saul openly pursued David with a significant portion of his army, forcing David to become a fugitive and a leader of outlaws. This period of desperate flight and wandering in the wilderness proved to be a crucible for David's leadership, where he forged the alliances and honed the skills that would ultimately enable him to succeed Saul as king. David's time as a fugitive was a masterclass in guerrilla warfare and political cunning. He established a headquarters at the Cave of Adullam, a natural fortress in the rugged Judean wilderness. From this base, he attracted a diverse group of followers, men who were in distress, in debt, or discontented with Saul's increasingly erratic rule. This growing band, which eventually numbered hundreds of men, formed the core of what would become David's loyal, professional army. He trained them in military tactics suited for the terrain, turning a collection of disaffected men into a disciplined fighting force. Their existence as outlaws also meant they had to live off the land and, on occasion, from the surrounding communities, creating a complex relationship with the very people they were meant to protect. David's flight was a constant game of cat and mouse, a series of narrow escapes and strategic retreats. On at least 2 occasions he had the opportunity to kill the slumbering Saul, but refused to do so. These acts of restraint were not just personal, they were shrewd political calculations. By refusing to harm the Lord's anointed, David demonstrated his deep respect for the sacred nature of the kingship, a powerful message to a population that was growing disillusioned with Saul. It allowed him to portray himself not as a power-hungry usurper, but as a righteous man who was being unjustly persecuted. The relentless pressure from Saul eventually forced David into an even more precarious position. He sought refuge with the Philistines, the very enemy he had famously defeated. King Achish of Gath, seeing David as a potential asset against Saul, granted him control over the border town of Ziklag. From this strategic location, David continued to consolidate his power, while feigning allegiance to the Philistines by conducting raids on nomadic tribes that posed a threat to both Israel and Philistine interests. This period of wandering transformed David from a court hero into a seasoned, battle-hardened military and political leader. He emerged from the wilderness as a proven king in his own right, ready to claim the throne when the time was right. The relentless pressure of the Philistine threat, combined with the profound internal conflict of his reign, brought King Saul to a state of utter desperation. He had lost his divine favor, his family was divided, and the man he feared most, David, was now a rival and a potential Philistine ally. As the Philistine army massed for a decisive battle at Shunem, Saul found himself at his most vulnerable. The historical record indicates a widespread absence of divine guidance for the king. He sought answers through traditional means such as dreams, the sacred Urim and the prophets, but received no response. In a desperate and anachronistic act, Saul turned to a practice he himself had once outlawed: necromancy. Saul's decision to consult a medium, or a witch of Endor, was a profound act of desperation and a final, defiant rejection of the very laws he was meant to uphold as king. Necromancy, the practice of communicating with the dead, was considered a heinous spiritual transgression in Israelite society. The king's disguise and journey to the medium's remote dwelling underscore the clandestine and forbidden nature of his mission. He was no longer a king seeking divine counsel, but a terrified man, stripped of his authority and seeking forbidden knowledge to stave off an inevitable doom. The medium, after some hesitation, agreed to conjure the spirit of Samuel. The ensuing appearance of the dead prophet was a pivotal and profoundly tragic moment. It was not a comforting vision or a source of hope, but a dire and unsparing confrontation with the consequences of Saul's disobedience. The narrative presents Samuel's spirit as a figure of solemn and unyielding judgment. The prophet's first words to the king were a rebuke for disturbing his rest, followed by a stark restatement of the divine rejection that had defined Saul's latter years. Samuel reiterated that the kingdom had been torn from his grasp and given to his rival, David, as a direct consequence of his failure to follow the command to destroy the Amalekites. The prophecy delivered by Samuel was a final, tragic forecast of Saul's impending doom. He foretold that not only would the Philistines defeat the Israelite army, but that Saul and his sons would be killed in the battle. The prophecy offered no hope, no chance for redemption, and no path to victory. It was a bleak and uncompromising declaration of an inevitable end. The effect on Saul was immediate and devastating. He collapsed in despair, understanding that his kingship, his family, and his life were all forfeit. This event serves as a powerful historical marker, demonstrating the king's complete spiritual and psychological breakdown, and setting the stage for the final bloody battle that would end the first Israelite monarchy. The Battle of Mount Gilboa was the final and decisive confrontation that brought an end to the first Israelite monarchy. Following Saul's desperate and dire prophecy from the spirit of Samuel, the Philistine army advanced to the plain of Jezreel, establishing a fortified camp at Shunem. This was a strategically significant location, as it allowed them to cut off communications between the northern and southern Israelite tribes. Saul, in a state of deep despair, was forced to confront them on the heights of Mount Gilboa. The terrain, while offering some defensive advantages, was ultimately a poor choice for the Israelite forces, as it exposed them to the Philistines' superior archery and heavy infantry. The battle itself was a catastrophic defeat for the Israelite army. The Philistine forces, having the strategic high ground and superior weaponry, quickly overwhelmed the Israelite infantry. The narrative explicitly states that the archers found him, indicating that the Philistine archers, likely using more advanced composite bows, were instrumental in the Israelite rout. The first casualties included Saul's 3 sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua, who were killed in the initial phases of the battle. Jonathan's death, in particular, was a profound loss, as he was a capable military leader and the heir apparent to the throne. His death left the succession in question and eliminated any chance for a peaceful transition of power. Wounded and facing certain capture, a fate that would have meant public humiliation and torture, Saul made a final, desperate decision. He requested that his armor-bearer kill him, an act that would have been seen as a merciful end. When his armor-bearer refused, Saul fell on his own sword, an act of ritual suicide that was a common practice among defeated military leaders in the ancient Near East. This final act of a king who had lost everything was one of both defiance and dishonor. It was a rejection of capture and a desperate attempt to maintain a final vestige of control over his fate. The aftermath of the battle was a brutal and humiliating spectacle. The Philistines, finding Saul's body and those of his sons, decapitated them and hung their armor and heads in the temples of their gods. Saul's body was affixed to the wall of Beth-shan, a Canaanite city under Philistine control. This act was a powerful display of Philistine dominance and a final public desecration of the king who had so recently challenged their power. The men of Jabesh Gilead, remembering Saul's miraculous rescue of their city years earlier, risked their lives to retrieve the bodies and provide them with a proper burial. This final act of loyalty and gratitude brought a tragic closure to the story of the first Israelite king. With Saul and his legitimate heirs dead, the kingdom was plunged into a succession crisis, setting the stage for a bloody civil war and the rise of a new king. Following the final, irreparable break with King Saul, the prophet Samuel was directed to seek out a new king for Israel. This anointing was to be a clandestine affair, a stark contrast to the public assembly that had legitimized Saul's reign. The location of this pivotal event was the town of Bethlehem, a small and seemingly insignificant community within the tribe of Judah. Samuel's journey to Bethlehem was shrouded in secrecy, disguised as a religious festival to avoid arousing the suspicion of King Saul's agents, who would have viewed any such act as a direct challenge to his throne and grounds for treason. The man chosen for this destiny was not a member of the established aristocracy or a seasoned warrior, but a young shepherd named David, the youngest son of Jesse. The initial presentation of Jesse's older sons to Samuel revealed a key theme that would define the rest of this era. Samuel, in his search for a king, was initially drawn to Eliab, the eldest, a man of impressive stature who looked the part of a great ruler. However, a divine instruction cautioned the prophet against judging by outward appearance, stating that a king was to be chosen not for physical prowess or a commanding presence, but for a heart that was aligned with divine purpose. This principle would be a fundamental contrast to the people's earlier demand for a king like all the nations, a demand that had been answered with the physically imposing but ultimately flawed Saul. David's selection was an act of divine foresight. He was brought from the fields where he was tending his father's sheep, a humble background that emphasized the non-political nature of his calling. His anointing with oil, performed by Samuel in the presence of his immediate family, was a private symbolic act that confirmed his future destiny. This moment was the beginning of his kingship, an event that would remain a secret for years, as he continued to live the life of a shepherd and a musician. The anointing did not immediately grant him power or a throne, but it did, according to the narrative, instill within him the Spirit of the Lord. This spiritual endowment was what enabled him to accomplish the extraordinary feats that would later bring him into the public eye, including his defeat of Goliath and his military successes. The clandestine nature of this anointing was a shrewd political necessity. Had Saul become aware of it, David would have been immediately branded as a traitor and a usurper, a threat to be eliminated. This secret coronation allowed David to develop his skills as a leader and military commander organically, without the pressure of public expectation or the paranoia of a tyrannical king. The years that followed were a prolonged and dramatic period of testing, where the young man who was chosen in a secret ceremony would prove his worthiness to a nation that was still unaware of his destiny. The relentless and irrational pursuit by King Saul forced David to make a radical and strategically complex decision, to seek refuge in the court of his most formidable enemy, the Philistines. This move, which seemed to defy logic and national loyalty, was a profound act of political and military survival. The Philistine city of Gath, the home of the giant Goliath whom David had slain, became his temporary sanctuary. This decision was based on a calculated risk that King Achish of Gath would view David not as a national hero, but as a valuable asset against his primary rival, King Saul. David's initial encounter with Achish was fraught with danger. Recognizing the risk that he would be executed for his past military triumphs, David feigned madness, an act of desperation that proved successful in convincing Achish that he was not a viable military threat. However, this ruse was a temporary measure. David's true strategic genius was revealed when he later negotiated a permanent arrangement with the Philistine king. He requested a place to live away from the Philistine capital, a request that Achish granted by giving him control over the town of Ziklag, a border settlement between Philistine and Israelite territories. This position was a masterstroke of political cunning. From Ziklag, David was able to operate with a degree of autonomy that he could not have achieved in Saul's kingdom. He ruled over his growing band of followers, which now included a diverse collection of outlaws, mercenaries, and disaffected Israelites. To maintain his favor with Achish, David feigned raids on Israelite towns, a deception that he maintained by presenting the Philistine king with plunder taken from nomadic tribes in the Negev. This allowed him to convince Achish of his continued loyalty, while simultaneously building his own military and economic power base without harming his own people. David's time in Ziklag was a critical period of preparation for his future kingship. He honed his skills as a military commander and a political administrator, governing a complex and diverse community. He forged alliances with local leaders, learned the intricacies of border politics, and demonstrated a capacity for leadership that extended far beyond his previous role as a military hero. When the Philistine armies later massed for the fateful battle against Saul at Mount Gilboa, David and his men were deliberately excluded from the campaign by Achish's suspicious commanders. This exclusion, while frustrating at the time, was a providential event that saved David from having to fight against his own people and his king. It ensured that when news of Saul's death arrived, David would be in a position of strength, untainted by the defeat, and ready to claim the throne. The news of the catastrophic defeat at Mount Gilboa and the deaths of King Saul and his sons reached David in Ziklag. This moment, which could have been a cause for celebration for a rival awaiting his chance, was instead met with a profound and public display of grief. The news was delivered by a young man who, seeking favor from the presumed new king, claimed to have delivered the fatal blow to a mortally wounded Saul. David's reaction was not one of gratitude for the removal of a rival, but one of immediate sorrow and a condemnation of the messenger. He ordered the man's execution, an act that served a dual purpose. It punished an opportunist for claiming to have killed the Lord's anointed, and it sent a clear, powerful message to the entire nation about the sacred nature of the kingship, even one that had been rejected. This act of justice was followed by a prolonged and public period of mourning. David tore his clothes, fasted, and composed a great lament, a poetic elegy known as the Song of the Bow. This lament was not a mere formality. It was a deeply emotional and strategically brilliant act. The elegy praised not only his close friend Jonathan, whose death was a genuine personal tragedy for David, but also King Saul himself. He described their lives as intertwined, and their deaths as a national catastrophe. David praised Saul's military might and lamented the loss of the first king, refusing to speak ill of the man who had relentlessly pursued him. He called on the people to mourn and remember the former king, demonstrating a magnanimity that was as rare as it was politically astute. David's lament served as a powerful legitimizing document for his own future kingship. By honoring Saul and Jonathan, he presented himself not as a usurper who rejoiced in their downfall, but as the natural and righteous successor who carried on their legacy. This was a direct contrast to Saul's own paranoid reign, which had been characterized by vengeance and personal ambition. David's grief was genuine, particularly for Jonathan, but the public nature of his mourning was a political masterstroke that demonstrated his moral and ethical superiority. He was a leader who could unite a nation in grief, rather than divide it in conflict. The lament was a political unifier designed to heal the deep wounds of the civil war and the military defeat. It provided a common ground for all the tribes, regardless of their past allegiance to Saul. It gave the house of Saul a sense of honor in defeat, and allowed the kingdom to transition from a period of violent division to one of national reconciliation. By the time the mourning period was over, David had firmly established his moral authority and magnanimity in the eyes of the people. Following the public mourning for King Saul and his sons, David, now with his moral authority firmly established, made his move to claim the throne. This was not an act of usurpation but a carefully considered political maneuver. His first move was to seek divine guidance on where to go. The response directed him to Hebron, a historically significant city in the territory of his own tribe, Judah. This choice was both symbolic and strategic. Hebron was the ancient burial place of the patriarchs and a central hub for the tribe of Judah, providing a strong, legitimate power base from which to launch his claim to the kingship. Upon his arrival in Hebron, the elders of Judah, recognizing David's popularity, military prowess, and the private anointing he had received from Samuel years earlier, came to him and anointed him as their king. This was the first of 2 coronations for David. It was a local, tribal affair that solidified his control over his own people, but it did not grant him authority over the rest of Israel. The kingdom, far from being united, was now officially and geographically divided. David was king of Judah in the south, a position that was both a triumph and a provocation. The northern tribes of Israel, still loyal to the house of Saul, were not without a leader. Abner, Saul's cousin and the commander of his army, was a powerful military and political figure who was determined to preserve the dynasty. He installed Saul's surviving son, Ishbosheth, as king of Israel in the city of Mahanaim, east of the Jordan River. This act created a formal schism. The newly formed nation of Israel, so recently united under Saul, was now torn apart by a power struggle between 2 competing houses. Ishbosheth, a relatively weak figure, was little more than a figurehead. The true power lay with his general, Abner, who effectively ruled the northern kingdom. The ensuing conflict was a prolonged civil war. The military forces of the house of Saul, led by Abner, clashed with David's growing army, commanded by his nephew Joab. This was a war of attrition, marked by skirmishes, raids, and a tense stalemate. The rivalry was not just between 2 kings, but between 2 commanders, Abner and Joab, who would engage in a bitter and personal struggle for supremacy. For 7.5 years the nation was divided, its resources and people consumed by a conflict that was a direct result of Saul's tragic end. David's kingship over Judah was a critical first step, but it was also a political declaration of war that would set the stage for a bloody battle for the soul of the kingdom. The anointing of David as king of Judah and the parallel installation of Ishbosheth as king of Israel by the general Abner plunged the fledgling nation into a 7-year civil war. This was not a simple military campaign, but a complex and bitter conflict of attrition, marked by political intrigue, localized skirmishes, and a devastating loss of life. The 2 houses, once united under Saul, were now diametrically opposed, with the balance of power constantly shifting. The primary figures in this conflict were not the kings themselves, but their military commanders. Joab, David's fiercely loyal and highly effective nephew, commanded the forces of Judah. Abner, Saul's cousin and the architect of Ishbosheth's kingship, was the de facto ruler of the northern tribes. The rivalry between these 2 men was personal and intense, fueled by a deep-seated hatred that began with a symbolic, yet bloody, encounter. The 2 armies met at the pool of Gibeon, where a challenge for a duel between 12 men from each side escalated into a full-scale battle, a fight that demonstrated the futility and bloodshed of the entire conflict. Abner, a seasoned veteran, initially had the advantage in both military strength and territorial control. He commanded the bulk of the Israelite tribes, who were still loyal to the house of Saul, and his tactical skills were well known. However, David's army, while smaller, was a more cohesive and professional force, honed by years of guerrilla warfare. The conflict continued as a series of raids and skirmishes, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. The political situation, however, began to shift in David's favor. The final phase of the war was not decided on the battlefield, but through political intrigue. Abner, growing increasingly disillusioned with the weak figurehead Ishbosheth, made a fateful decision to defect to David's side. His defection was a pivotal moment. With the most powerful military commander of the northern tribes now on David's side, the war was effectively over. Abner promised to deliver all of Israel to David, a promise he was capable of keeping. However, a tragic act of vengeance prematurely ended this political realignment. Joab, still bitter over Abner's killing of his brother Asahel in an earlier battle, assassinated Abner. This act of cold-blooded murder was not only a personal crime, but a political disaster. David, understanding the profound implications of Joab's actions, publicly mourned Abner and distanced himself from the act, demonstrating his legitimacy and magnanimity to the northern tribes. The war's end was a complicated and messy affair, marked by the death of its two greatest generals, and leaving a clear path for David to finally unite the kingdom. The assassination of Abner, the powerful commander of Saul's army, effectively ended the civil war and left the northern kingdom of Israel in a state of political paralysis. The figurehead king, Ishbosheth, was a weak and indecisive ruler whose authority had always been a direct extension of his general. With Abner's death, the political and military glue holding the northern tribes together dissolved, creating a power vacuum and a climate of profound instability. This was a critical moment for David's political aspirations, but it was also a period of immense danger as the absence of central authority invited violence and opportunism. The end of Ishbosheth's brief and ineffectual reign came not on the battlefield, but through an act of cold-blooded regicide. Baanah and Rechab, two of Ishbosheth's own captains from the tribe of Benjamin, saw the king's weakness as an opportunity for personal gain. They infiltrated the king's house in the middle of the day while he was resting on his bed. The murder of Ishbosheth was a cowardly and treacherous act carried out against a defenseless man, and it was a direct violation of the sanctity of the kingship, a concept that was still a fragile and novel idea for the Israelites. After the murder, Baanah and Rechab decapitated the king and fled to Hebron, bringing Ishbosheth's head to David with the expectation of a reward. They presented their heinous act as an act of loyalty to David, claiming to have avenged him against his enemy, the son of Saul. They believed that this act would not only end the succession crisis, but also make them heroes in the eyes of the new king. However, their assessment of David's character was profoundly and tragically mistaken. David's reaction was one of fury and condemnation. He saw the assassination not as a political advantage, but as a treacherous and sacrilegious crime. He rebuked the captains for their audacity and for their lack of respect for the kingship. David recalled how he had earlier executed a man who merely claimed to have killed Saul, the Lord's anointed. This new crime was far worse, an act of unprovoked murder against a rival who, though a king, was a defenseless man and the last living political link to Saul's dynasty. As a result, David ordered the immediate execution of Baanah and Rechab, and had their hands and feet cut off, and their bodies hung in public as a warning against such treachery. The head of Ishbosheth was buried with full honours, a final act of magnanimity that was meant to heal the wounds of the civil war and demonstrate David's legitimacy and his commitment to a just and honourable rule. The final brutal end of the civil war and the executions of Ishbosheth's assassins cleared the path for the unification of Israel under a single monarch. With the house of Saul now defunct and its last legitimate political link severed, the northern tribes were left without a leader. the assassination of Abner had deprived them of their most capable military commander and political power broker, leaving them vulnerable and searching for a new source of authority. David, whose capital was in the south at Hebron, was the obvious and most legitimate choice. His magnanimous acts the mourning of Saul and Abner and the avenging of Ishbosheth's murder had firmly established his moral and political credentials in the eyes of all the tribes, not just Judah. This moment of unification was a formal and deliberate political act, not a spontaneous outpouring of support. The elders of all the tribes of Israel, representing the political will of the nation, traveled to Hebron to negotiate with David. Their arrival at David's court was a crucial diplomatic event, a recognition of his authority and a legal and social re-establishment of the national covenant. The elders' primary concerns were twofold: security and legitimacy. They recognized David's prowess as a military leader and his capacity to deliver them from their enemies, particularly the Philistines. They also saw in him a legitimate successor to the throne, a man who had not only been anointed by Samuel, but had also demonstrated a deep respect for the sanctity of the kingship. The negotiations culminated in a covenant made before the Lord. This was a powerful religious and political statement. By swearing their allegiance to David, the elders were not just making a political pact, but a sacred one. This anointing was the third for David, and the first to unite all 12 tribes. This final act in Hebron was the formal inauguration of a single unified kingdom. David, who had previously been the king of a single tribe, now held the throne over all of Israel. The significance of this unification cannot be overstated. For the first time since their emergence from the wilderness, the Israelite tribes were a single political entity, with a unified military, a shared government, and a common purpose. The period of the judges, with its chaotic cycles of oppression and deliverance, had ended. The era of civil war was over. The nation could now turn its full attention to the external threats that had plagued it for generations. This unification provided the stability and strength needed for a golden age of national expansion, a period in which the new kingdom would transform from a collection of fragmented tribes into a formidable regional power. With the unification of the 12 tribes under his kingship, David's next strategic objective was to establish a new capital. His existing capital, Hebron, while historically significant and central to the tribe of Judah, was not a viable long-term solution. It was a southern city, which could be perceived as favoring Judah over the northern tribes, potentially reigniting the very sectionalism that had fueled the recent civil war. A new capital was needed, a neutral territory, geographically central to all 12 tribes, and a secure fortress that could serve as a symbol of unity and a center of national power. David's choice was the Jebusite city of Jerusalem. At the time, Jerusalem was not an Israelite city. It was a fortified stronghold of a small Canaanite group known as the Jebusites, who had managed to maintain their independence in the heart of the Israelite-controlled highlands. The city was an ideal choice for a capital for several reasons. Geographically, it was situated almost perfectly between the northern and southern tribes, a key factor in promoting national cohesion. Topographically, it was an incredibly strong natural fortress, built on a narrow spur with deep valleys on 3 sides. The Jebusites, confident in their city's impregnability, famously mocked David, claiming that its defenses were so strong that the blind and the lame could defend it. The capture of Jerusalem was a strategic military operation that demonstrated David's tactical brilliance. The narrative suggests that the city's main vulnerability lay not in its walls but in its water supply. The Jebusites drew their water from a spring at the base of the city, which was connected to the interior by a vertical shaft, a feature likely discovered through intelligence gathering. David's commander Joab led a surprise assault by infiltrating the city through this water shaft, a daring and unconventional maneuver that allowed a small group of soldiers to open the gates from the inside. The city fell swiftly and with minimal casualties. Upon capturing the city, David did not destroy it or its Jebusite inhabitants. Instead, he made Jerusalem his own, transforming it into the city of David. This was a brilliant political act. By making a neutral, non-Israelite city the capital, David avoided any appearance of tribal favoritism and provided all the tribes with a common national home. He did not impose his own tribal identity on the city. He created a new, pan-Israelite one. The capture of Jerusalem provided the fledgling kingdom with the secure political and military center it had always lacked, a fortified capital from which David could now consolidate his power, administer justice, and lead the nation into a new era of expansion and influence. With a new, politically neutral capital established in Jerusalem, David's next strategic move was to transform the city into the spiritual heart of the nation. This required the relocation of the most sacred object of Israelite faith, the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark, which contained the stone tablets of the law, was a powerful symbol of the divine presence and the national covenant. After its capture by the Philistines and its subsequent return to Israel, it had been housed in the town of Kirjath-Jearim, a location far from the centers of political power. Its absence from the national stage reflected the spiritual and political fragmentation of the era of the Judges and Saul's kingship. David's decision to bring the Ark to Jerusalem was a deliberate and calculated act to fuse the political and religious identities of the new kingdom. It was a move that would not only legitimize his rule in the eyes of the people, but also confirm Jerusalem's status as the divinely chosen capital. The procession to bring the Ark to Jerusalem was, therefore, not just a logistical exercise, but a major national event. The journey was planned with immense care, involving a large delegation of priests, Levites, and an entourage of 30,000 men, all participating in a grand public procession. However, the initial attempt to move the Ark was met with a catastrophic failure that underscored the profound spiritual significance of the sacred object. The Ark was placed on a new cart, a method of transport that, while common for non-sacred items, was a direct violation of the ancient law, which dictated that it could only be carried by Levites using poles. When the cart stumbled, a man named Uzzah reached out to steady it and was immediately struck dead. This tragic event halted the procession and instilled a deep fear in David, who interpreted the death as a divine rebuke for his improper handling of the holy object. Following this failure, David took 3 months to reconsider the process. The Ark was housed in the home of Obed-Edom, where its presence brought a blessing to the household, a sign that the divine presence was not hostile, but that its laws had to be strictly observed. The second procession was conducted with meticulous attention to the ancient regulations. The Ark was carried on the shoulders of the Levites, accompanied by a joyous and elaborate procession of music, dancing, and sacrifices. This second, successful journey was a profound public spectacle. David, in a powerful symbolic act, cast off his royal robes and danced before the Ark in a linen ephod, an act that demonstrated his humility and his subordination to the divine. The Ark was finally placed in a temporary tent in the new capital. With the Ark of the Covenant now in its center, Jerusalem was transformed. It was no longer just the political capital of the kingdom, but also its undisputed religious heart, a sacred space where the divine presence was believed to reside. This act cemented David's legitimacy as king and provided the new nation with a powerful centralizing symbol that would unite the 12 tribes under a common faith and a shared national identity. The successful relocation of the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem marked the culmination of David's efforts to unify the kingdom both politically and spiritually. With the Ark now residing in the capital, the nation's political and religious centers were one and the same. This moment of national cohesion and spiritual triumph set the stage for one of the most significant theological and political events of David's reign: the establishment of the Davidic covenant. This covenant, which was not a pact between two equals but a unilateral divine promise, would provide the theological foundation for the monarchy for centuries to come and establish the basis for the future messianic hope of the nation. David, now secure in his kingship and his capital, expressed a desire to build a permanent temple, a grand stone structure to house the Ark of the Covenant. This idea was an anachronistic notion for a nomadic people whose worship had always been conducted in a portable tent, but it was a logical progression for a king who had built a permanent political capital. However, through the prophet Nathan, David received a surprising divine message. He was not to be the one to build the temple, an honor that would be reserved for his son, but a greater promise was being made to him. The promise, known as the Davidic covenant, was an unconditional assurance that his lineage would endure forever. The divine promise to David was that your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. This was a pivotal moment in the political history of Israel. Unlike the covenant at Sinai, which was conditional on the people's obedience, the Davidic covenant was a promise of an eternal dynasty. It transformed the kingship from a temporary political office, which had been conditional in Saul's time, into a permanent and divinely sanctioned institution. This covenant had profound and immediate consequences. It legitimized the Davidic monarchy in a way that no political negotiation or military victory could. It established the principle of dynastic succession, ensuring a stable line of kings from David's family. More importantly, it established Jerusalem as a divinely chosen city, and the Davidic line as a divinely chosen dynasty. This covenant became a cornerstone of Israelite national identity. In times of military defeat, political corruption, and national exile, the promise of an eternal Davidic throne provided a powerful and enduring hope. It was this promise that gave rise to the expectation of a future messianic king, a son of David, who would one day restore the kingdom to its former glory and reign forever. Following the unification of the 12 tribes and the establishment of a centralized capital, the next major development of David's reign was the professionalization of the Israelite military. The era of the judges had been characterized by a decentralized military, relying on a system of tribal militias and ad hoc mobilizations. This model had proven ineffective against organized enemies like the Philistines. David, a former outlaw and military commander, understood this weakness intimately. He transformed the kingdom's military from a citizen militia into a formidable standing army, a key factor in his ability to expand the kingdom and dominate the region. The core of this new army was David's own loyal followers, the same men who had been with him during his years as a fugitive. This group, initially a collection of outlaws and disaffected men, had been forged into a disciplined, battle-hardened force. They were not a conscripted army, but a professional, full-time military. Their loyalty was personal, a direct bond to David that transcended tribal allegiances. This personal army, often referred to as the Mighty Men, formed the elite guard and the officer corps of the new military. Their presence in Jerusalem also ensured David's security and provided a strong counterbalance to any tribal factionalism that might re-emerge. David's military innovations were not limited to the creation of a professional corps. He also established a system of conscription and military organization that allowed him to raise a large national army when needed for major campaigns. The military was organized into a rotational system, with different tribal units serving in Jerusalem on a regular basis. This system ensured that a large pool of trained soldiers was always available, while also fostering a sense of national identity among the various tribes who served together. The result of these changes was a military that was a direct reflection of David's own strategic genius. He employed a combined arms approach, utilizing heavy infantry, light armored skirmishers, and an effective cavalry force. The new army was not only skilled in pitched battles, but also adept at siege warfare and guerrilla tactics, skills learned during David's years as a fugitive. This military force, along with the newfound unity of the kingdom, allowed David to launch a series of successful campaigns against his neighbors, a period of expansion that would see the Israelite kingdom grow to its greatest territorial extent. The transformation from a collection of shepherds and farmers into a professional military machine was a defining feature of David's reign and a prerequisite for the golden age that would follow. With a unified kingdom and a professional army at his command, David turned his attention to the external threats that had plagued the Israelite tribes for generations. This period was not one of defensive skirmishes, but a series of systematic military campaigns that transformed the kingdom from a small regional power into a formidable empire that controlled a vast territory. The primary objective of these wars of conquest was to subdue the surrounding nations that had previously oppressed or threatened Israelite security, establishing a buffer zone and securing vital trade routes. The first and most critical campaign was against the Philistines, the very people whose technological superiority and relentless pressure had prompted the demand for a king in the first place. David's army, now a professional force, engaged the Philistines in a series of decisive battles. Unlike the era of the Judges, where victories were temporary and followed by periods of oppression, David's campaigns were aimed at permanent subjugation. He attacked their major city-states, including Gath, and successfully curtailed their military and economic power. The narrative suggests that the Philistine threat was so thoroughly neutralized that they never again posed a serious threat to Israelite sovereignty, a testament to David's strategic genius and the effectiveness of his new military. Following the subjugation of the Philistines, David launched campaigns against the nations to the east and north. The Ammonites, who had a history of conflict with Israel and had recently besieged Jabesh Gilead, were a prime target. David's army laid siege to their capital, Rabbah, in a campaign that lasted for a considerable period, demonstrating the kingdom's newfound capacity for sustained warfare. The capture of Rabbah and the subjugation of the Ammonites not only eliminated a key rival, but also provided the kingdom with vast amounts of plunder and tribute, which would contribute to the nation's wealth. Simultaneously, David campaigned against the Moabites, the Edomites, and the Aramean city-states to the north. These campaigns were crucial for securing the kingdom's borders and controlling vital trade routes. The subjugation of the Arameans in particular was a significant achievement. The Aramean kingdoms, centered around Damascus, were powerful regional players who controlled key commercial arteries. David's victories over them expanded his kingdom's influence far to the north, securing tribute and wealth that solidified his status as a major geopolitical force. This period of rapid expansion was a direct result of the political and military centralization of the kingdom under David. It transformed the Israelite kingdom from a beleaguered group of tribes into a dominant regional power, a golden age of military and territorial growth that would be remembered for generations. The period of David's military and political dominance, a golden age of national expansion and prosperity, was marred by a profound and tragic moral failure. This was not a public transgression on the battlefield or a political miscalculation, but a personal sin committed in the privacy of his court that would cast a dark shadow over his legacy and unleash a cycle of devastating consequences on his family. The narrative of David and Bathsheba is a stark reminder of the corrupting influence of absolute power and the vulnerability of even the most revered leaders. The events unfolded while David's army, led by his commander Joab, was engaged in the siege of Rabbah against the Ammonites. The king, secure in his capital of Jerusalem, was separated from the battlefield. From the rooftop of his palace, he saw Bathsheba, a woman of exceptional beauty, bathing. This act, fueled by an abuse of royal power, led to an adulterous affair. Bathsheba became pregnant, a fact that threatened to expose both her and the king to public scandal, and a legal punishment that was severe. In a desperate and systematic attempt to conceal his sin, David engaged in a series of calculated deceptions. He summoned Bathsheba's husband, Uriah the Hittite, from the battlefield. Uriah was not only a loyal soldier, but a member of David's elite guard, his mighty men. David initially attempted to manipulate Uriah into sleeping with his wife, hoping to provide a cover story for the pregnancy. However, Uriah, demonstrating a profound sense of military honor and loyalty, refused to go home to his wife while his comrades were fighting on the front lines. His refusal thwarted David's plan. With his initial deception a failure, David resorted to a far more heinous crime: murder. He sent Uriah back to the battlefield with a sealed letter for Joab, his commander. The letter contained instructions to place Uriah on the front lines in the fiercest part of the battle, and then to withdraw, ensuring his death. Joab, a seasoned military commander who understood the nature of the order, carried it out. Uriah was killed, and David, with the obstacle removed, married Bathsheba, believing his sin was successfully concealed. This moral failure had severe and lasting consequences. It was a betrayal of a loyal subject, an abuse of power, and a direct violation of both the moral and legal codes of the nation. It demonstrated that even a king who had been divinely chosen and promised an eternal dynasty was not immune to the corrupting influence of power and personal appetite. This tragic moral failure would be a turning point in David's reign, marking the end of the period of triumphant expansion and ushering in an era of internal turmoil, political intrigue, and devastating family conflict. David's calculated efforts to conceal his sin in the affair of Bathsheba and Uriah were, for a time, successful. The court was unaware of his transgressions, and the public was oblivious to the murder of a loyal soldier. The historical record suggests a period of silence following these events, a time when the king may have believed he had successfully escaped the consequences of his actions. However, this period of secrecy was broken by a decisive and courageous act of prophetic confrontation. The prophet Nathan, a figure of immense spiritual authority, was sent to expose the king's hidden crimes and force him to acknowledge his moral failure. Nathan's method was a masterstroke of political and psychological cunning. He did not directly accuse the powerful king, an act that would have been tantamount to suicide. Instead, he presented David with a parable, a narrative device that allowed the king to pass judgment on a hypothetical situation before realizing the story was a mirror of his own actions. The parable concerned a wealthy man with vast flocks and herds who, when a visitor arrived, took a single pet lamb from a poor man and prepared it for his guest. The poor man, having no other possessions, cherished the lamb as a member of his own family. David, known for his sense of justice and his own background as a shepherd, was immediately incensed by the story. He declared that the rich man deserved to die for his cruel and selfish act. Nathan, in a dramatic and pivotal moment, then turned to the king and delivered the devastating pronouncement, "You are the man." The prophet's words cut through David's self-deception and forced him to confront the reality of his crimes. Nathan then proceeded to lay out the full scope of David's transgressions, the adultery with Bathsheba and the murder of her husband Uriah. The confrontation marked a profound turning point in David's reign. The king, stripped of his power and pride, offered no defense. He simply acknowledged his guilt with the words, "I have sinned against the Lord." This admission was a critical moment of personal and political accountability. However, while Nathan delivered a message of divine forgiveness for David's soul, he also pronounced a series of devastating judgments that would have severe and lasting consequences for his family and his kingdom. Nathan foretold that the sword shall never depart from your house, and that the public dishonor David had created in secret would be made manifest in a public and humiliating manner. This confrontation ended the period of silence and denial, ushering in an era of internal turmoil and tragic retribution that would forever change the course of David's life and his dynasty. The confrontation with the prophet Nathan marked a profound turning point in David's reign. The prophet's judgments were not abstract theological pronouncements, but a series of devastating, concrete prophecies about the consequences of David's sin that would manifest within his own family. The narrative of the years that followed is a tragic account of the fulfillment of those words, as a cycle of violence, rebellion, and death descended upon the king's household, sowing the seeds of the kingdom's future turmoil and succession crisis. The first consequence was the death of the child born from the adulterous union with Bathsheba. This was a swift and heartbreaking fulfillment of the prophecy, a devastating blow to David's personal life that demonstrated the direct and immediate link between his actions and a profound loss. Following this, the prophecy that the sword shall never depart from your house began to unfold with terrifying clarity. This was a metaphorical and literal statement. The years of peace and military triumph that had defined the first half of David's reign were over, replaced by a period of internal conflict and family strife. The first major tragedy was the rape of Tamar, one of David's daughters, by her half-brother Amnon. This act of incest was not only a profound personal trauma, but a direct violation of the sanctity of the royal family. David, while angered by the crime, was weak in his response, failing to bring justice to his son. This inaction created a festering wound in the family that would lead to further tragedy. 2 years later, Tamar's full brother, Absalom, a prince known for his beauty and charisma, took matters into his own hands. He avenged his sister's dishonor by having Amnon assassinated, an act of fratricide that forced Absalom to flee Jerusalem and live in exile for 3 years. The cycle of violence continued with Absalom's rebellion. Upon his return, he began a systematic and cunning campaign to usurp his father's throne, a direct fulfillment of the prophecy that "I will raise up evil against you from your own house." Absalom's revolt was a profound political challenge that forced David to flee his own capital. It was a humiliating and public display of the very dishonor that Nathan had foretold, a direct consequence of David's earlier secret sin. These family tragedies were not isolated incidents. They were a connected chain of events that demonstrated the profound and lasting consequences of a king's moral failings, a dark chapter that would define the rest of David's life and lay the groundwork for a bloody and bitter succession crisis. Absalom, the charismatic and ambitious son of David, was not merely a vengeful prince, but a master strategist who began a systematic conspiracy to usurp his father's throne. Following the assassination of his brother Amnon, Absalom had spent 3 years in political exile, a period that likely fueled his resentment and provided him with a clear-eyed view of his father's vulnerabilities. Upon his return to Jerusalem, he began a cunning 4-year campaign to win the hearts and minds of the Israelite people, a campaign that was a direct and devastating fulfillment of the prophecy that I will raise up evil against you from your own house. Absalom's political strategy was rooted in a sophisticated understanding of public sentiment. He positioned himself as a champion of the common person, a ruler who would be accessible and fair, in stark contrast to David's increasingly distant administration. By standing at the city gates, a traditional site for public discourse and legal appeals, he intercepted citizens who were seeking the king's justice. He lamented that they had no one to hear their grievances, effectively portraying himself as a sympathetic alternative to his father's court. His physical appearance and charisma, described as being without blemish and with a magnificent head of hair, were powerful tools in this public relations campaign, lending him an aura of strength and legitimacy. The conspiracy culminated in a meticulously planned coup d'état. Absalom, having won the loyalty of the people of Israel and with a powerful inner circle of advisors, requested permission from David to go to Hebron, the very city where David had first been anointed king, to offer a sacrifice. This request was a clever ruse. It allowed him to leave the capital without arousing suspicion and to mobilize his supporters in the southern part of the kingdom. At Hebron, Absalom was publicly declared king. The rebellion gained significant momentum when Ahithophel, one of David's most trusted and brilliant advisors, defected to Absalom's side. This move was a crippling blow to David's intelligence and military capabilities. The rebellion spread with such speed and force that David was faced with an untenable situation. His own intelligence networks had been compromised, and the loyalty of the people in the capital was in question. Rather than risk a bloody civil war in the streets of Jerusalem, a conflict that could have resulted in immense bloodshed and the desecration of the city, David made the difficult decision to flee. He left Jerusalem once again, this time not from a jealous king, but from his own ambitious son. His flight, which included his loyal court and his personal guard, was a profound public humiliation, a demonstration of the kingdom's internal fracturing and the tragic consequences of his earlier moral failings. Absalom's swift and successful coup d'état, which forced his father David to flee Jerusalem, marked the beginning of his brief and dramatic reign. The capital, with its political and religious institutions, was now under the control of the usurper. This period was not one of stable governance, but a fleeting moment of triumph for Absalom, who immediately set about consolidating his power and publicly dishonoring his father, a strategic move designed to secure the loyalty of the nation and demonstrate the finality of his rule. The first major act of Absalom's reign was a public and symbolic desecration of David's legacy. He was advised by Ahithophel, one of David's former counselors, to publicly cohabit with his father's concubines on the palace rooftop. This was not merely an act of sexual transgression, it was a deliberate and calculated political act. The act of taking a king's concubines was, in ancient Near Eastern tradition, a symbolic and legal claim to the throne. By doing so, Absalom was not only publicly humiliating his father, but also declaring to the entire nation that his reign was a final and irreversible break from David's. This public act of dishonor, as foretold by the prophet Nathan, was meant to demonstrate to the people that there was no possibility of reconciliation between father and son. Following this, Absalom's court, with the brilliant Ahithophel as its chief advisor, was tasked with formulating a military strategy to eliminate David. Ahithophel, a master tactician, proposed a swift and decisive plan to pursue David's small, weary army immediately. His plan was a sound one, as David and his followers were in a vulnerable state and lacked the resources to engage in a prolonged conflict. Had this plan been carried out, it is likely that Absalom's reign would have been a lasting one. However, this advice was countered by another of David's former advisors, Hushai, who had feigned loyalty to Absalom to act as a double agent for David. Hushai, through a clever and deceptive counter-proposal, convinced Absalom to reject Ahithophel's sound advice. He argued that David and his men were fierce and battle-hardened, and that a direct, immediate assault would be too risky. Instead, Hushai proposed gathering a massive army from all of Israel, a plan that, while appealing to Absalom's ego, would take a considerable amount of time. This delay was a crucial turning point. It gave David the time he needed to regroup, rally his forces, and prepare for a decisive confrontation. When Ahithophel realized that his brilliant plan had been rejected, he knew the rebellion was doomed. He returned home and committed suicide. A final act of a man who understood the strategic implications of Absalom's fatal error. The delay in Absalom's military campaign, a strategic blunder orchestrated by the cunning advice of Hushai, provided David with the precious time he needed to regroup and prepare for a decisive confrontation. Having fled Jerusalem, David established his headquarters in Mahanaim, a city east of the Jordan River. This location was a key strategic choice, as it was a secure area with a history of loyalty to Saul's house and provided David with a safe space to rally his forces. Here, he was met with the loyalty of his men and the support of local leaders, who provided him with much-needed supplies and provisions. David, a master of military organization, reorganized his army, dividing his forces into 3 divisions under the command of Joab, Abishai, and Ittai the Gittite. This decentralized command structure was a tactical innovation that would allow his army to operate more effectively in the difficult terrain ahead. The 2 armies finally met in the forest of Ephraim, a location that was a crucial factor in the battle's outcome. The terrain was not an open plain suitable for Absalom's large, newly mobilized army. Instead, it was a dense, rugged wilderness, a type of environment that favored David's smaller, more professional, and battle-hardened forces. David's army, veterans of years of guerrilla warfare and honed by the harsh conditions of their flight, were perfectly suited for fighting in such a chaotic and unforgiving landscape. The battle was a catastrophic defeat for Absalom's forces. His large army, unaccustomed to fighting in a dense forest, became disorganized and disoriented. The terrain, with its treacherous ravines and thick undergrowth, turned Absalom's numerical advantage into a liability. The biblical narrative is explicit. The forest devoured more people that day than the sword, a testament to the tactical superiority of David's strategic location. The rebellion's end was sealed with the dramatic and unconventional death of Absalom. As he rode through the forest, his hair, a symbol of his legendary beauty and charisma, became entangled in the branches of a large terebinth tree. When Joab, David's commander, was informed of his location, he disregarded David's explicit command to spare Absalom and brutally killed him. Joab's decisive action, while a personal betrayal of David's trust, was a pragmatic military and political necessity. It ended the rebellion immediately and prevented the possibility of a prolonged guerrilla war waged by Absalom's followers. The victory was complete, but it was a bitter one for David, a triumph over his own son that would be met not with joy, but with profound and heartbreaking grief. The decisive victory in the forest of Ephraim, which crushed Absalom's rebellion and secured David's throne, was received not with celebration in the king's camp, but with a profound and public display of grief. The news of Absalom's death, brought by a messenger to David at the city gate of Mahanaim, overshadowed the military triumph. The king, upon learning of his son's fate, was overwhelmed with sorrow. He ascended to a room above the gate and wept uncontrollably, crying out, "My son Absalom, my son Absalom!" If only I had died instead of you, Absalom, my son, my son. This public lament was a remarkable and historically significant moment, as it demonstrated a king's personal grief superseding a national victory. This powerful display of emotion had a demoralizing effect on David's army. The soldiers, who had risked their lives to secure the king's throne, returned from the battle victorious, but found no joy or praise awaiting them. Instead, they were met with a somber atmosphere, as if they had returned from a military defeat. The narrative describes how the army stole into the city that day, as people who are ashamed steal away when they flee in battle. This reaction was a direct consequence of David's public grief. His sorrow was so all-consuming that it made the army's victory feel hollow and without purpose. Joab, David's military commander, was faced with a critical political problem. The king's grief, left unchecked, threatened to fracture the loyalty of the very army that had saved his kingdom. In a decisive and confrontational act, Joab entered the king's private mourning space and confronted him directly. He rebuked David for his all-consuming sorrow, arguing that his actions were shaming the very men who had risked their lives for him. Joab's words were a blunt and powerful reminder of the king's duties, that his role as a leader demanded he prioritize the needs of his nation and his army over his personal feelings. He warned David that if he did not show gratitude and appreciation to his men, they would abandon him. A threat that was not subtle. Forced to choose between his private grief and his public duty, David relented. He went to the city gate and sat, a public gesture that allowed his victorious army to come and see him. This action was a restoration of order, a moment of public reconciliation that demonstrated David's ability to compartmentalize his personal pain and resume his role as the political and military head of the nation. While the grief remained, the immediate political crisis was averted. The profound complexity of David's character, a king whose heart was as deeply conflicted as it was capable of both great sin and great love, was laid bare for all to see. The suppression of Absalom's rebellion did not restore a sense of peace to David's reign. His final years were defined by a series of profound challenges that reflected the internal turmoil of a kingdom still struggling with its identity. The first major crisis was a devastating plague that swept the nation, a catastrophic event that the historical narrative links to David's decision to conduct a census. In ancient Near Eastern thought, a census was often viewed with suspicion, as it could be interpreted as an act of pride, a king's attempt to rely on his own military strength rather than divine providence. The narrative presents this act as a profound sin that resulted in a divine punishment, a plague that claimed the lives of thousands. The king's repentance, depicted as a plea for mercy on the threshing floor of Araunah, brought an end to the plague and provided the site for the future temple. This event, while a personal tragedy for David, was a stark reminder of the king's accountability and the fragility of a nation still dependent on divine favor. The latter part of David's reign was dominated by a delicate and dangerous succession crisis. Despite the divine promise of an eternal dynasty, the line of succession was not clear. With the deaths of his sons Amnon and Absalom, the path to the throne was open to new contenders. The primary rivals were Adonijah, the eldest surviving son, and Solomon, the son of Bathsheba. Adonijah, a charismatic and ambitious figure, began to consolidate his power in a manner similar to Absalom. He gathered a strong coalition of support, including the veteran commander Joab and the high priest Abiathar, and declared himself king. This was a direct challenge to the aging and increasingly frail David, who seemed unable to act. However, the succession was not yet decided. The other faction, led by the prophet Nathan and David's wife Bathsheba, moved quickly to secure Solomon's position. Their strategy was a masterstroke of political manipulation, involving a direct appeal to the ailing king and a dramatic emergency coronation. Nathan and Bathsheba orchestrated a plan where she would remind David of his promise to make Solomon king, while Nathan would corroborate her story. This led to David's decisive action. He ordered a secret anointing of Solomon by the high priest Zadok and the prophet Nathan. The sound of trumpets and shouts of "Long live King Solomon" announced the anointing, a clear sign to Adonijah's party that their bid for power had failed. Adonijah's supporters, upon hearing the news, scattered in fear. The transition of power, while dramatic and fraught with tension, was a decisive one. It set the stage for a new era of Israelite history, a period of unprecedented wealth and influence under the reign of Solomon. The decisive resolution of the succession crisis, which saw Solomon's anointing and the scattering of Adonijah's supporters, did not mean a peaceful transition of power. David, now nearing the end of his life, was a witness to the profound instability that had defined his final years and was determined to secure his son's throne. His final instructions to Solomon were a complex mixture of wise counsel for a young ruler and politically motivated commands for the elimination of his old rivals. This last will and testament was not merely a sentimental farewell, but a calculated act of statecraft, a final attempt to stabilize the kingdom by systematically removing any potential threats to Solomon's reign. David's counsel to his son was a classic exhortation to a new monarch. He urged Solomon to be strong and show yourself a man, reminding him of the divine covenant and the importance of adhering to the laws and statutes given to the nation. This was a direct lesson drawn from the failures of Saul's reign, a warning that the monarchy's legitimacy was contingent on its obedience to divine law. He advised Solomon to rule with justice and to walk in the path of righteousness, a necessary foundation for a king who would oversee a period of unprecedented peace and prosperity. However, intertwined with this righteous counsel were specific and brutal instructions for politically motivated vengeance. David explicitly ordered Solomon to take action against two of his oldest and most powerful rivals, Joab and Shimei. Joab, the commander of David's army, had been a loyal and highly effective general, but he was also a ruthless and politically ambitious figure who had committed several cold-blooded murders, including the assassinations of Abner and Absalom. David recognized that Joab's immense power and influence posed a threat to Solomon, a new and untested king. He commanded Solomon not to let his hoar head go down to the grave in peace, an unambiguous order to have him killed. Similarly, Shimei, a man from the house of Saul, had publicly cursed and reviled David during his flight from Absalom. David had sworn an oath not to kill him at the time, but he made it clear to Solomon that this oath was not binding on the new king. Shimei's past disloyalty and his continued presence in the kingdom were a constant reminder of the old rivalries and a potential rallying point for future rebellion. David's command to Solomon was to find a way to eliminate him, ensuring that no lingering threat from the previous dynasty remained. This final act of David's life was a testament to the pragmatic and often ruthless nature of ancient kingship. He was not just a father passing on a throne, but a weary monarch ensuring the survival of his legacy and his bloodline. By ordering the elimination of these powerful figures, David was clearing the path for a peaceful and undisputed succession for his son, a final act of statecraft that would provide the stability needed for the golden age that was to come. With David's final instructions delivered, Solomon's reign began not with a period of celebration, but with a calculated and decisive purge of his rivals. This was not a moment for mercy or reconciliation, but a practical and often ruthless demonstration of a new king's power. Solomon, an untested monarch, understood that his throne was still vulnerable, and that the lingering threats and old rivalries from David's reign had to be systematically eliminated to secure his rule. This was a classic consolidation of power, a period of political cleansing that set the stage for his golden age of peace. The first to be dealt with was his half-brother, Adonijah. Despite having been forgiven for his initial attempt to seize the throne, Adonijah made a final, fatal political blunder. He requested permission to marry Abishag, the young woman who had cared for the aging David. This was not a romantic request. In ancient Near Eastern culture, taking a deceased king's concubine was a symbolic act of claiming his throne. Solomon, recognizing the thinly veiled threat, saw this as an act of treason. He had Adonijah executed, a swift and uncompromising message that he would tolerate no lingering challenges to his authority. The purge of Adonijah's supporters followed. The high priest Abiathar, who had sided with Adonijah, was deposed from his office and sent into exile. This act consolidated the priesthood under the new king's control, a critical move for a ruler who would later build the temple. The next target was Joab, the powerful and politically ambitious commander of David's army. Joab, upon realizing his bid for Adonijah was a failure, sought sanctuary at the altar, a traditional place of refuge. However, Solomon, acting on his father's final command, sent a new commander, Benaiah, to kill him. Joab was a legendary military figure, but his loyalty was always conditional on his own political ambition. His removal was a necessary act to ensure that the new king had total control of his army. His death was a final, bloody testament to the ruthless nature of power transitions in the ancient world. Finally, Solomon addressed the threat from Shimei, the man from the house of Saul who had cursed David. He did not kill Shimei outright. Instead, he placed him under house arrest in Jerusalem, with a clear warning that if he ever left the city, he would be executed. 3 years later, when Shimei left to retrieve his runaway slaves, Solomon had him killed. This act, while perhaps appearing disproportionate, was a final, cold-blooded elimination of a lingering political threat. By systematically removing these powerful figures, Solomon demonstrated a practical and calculating approach to governance. The purge, while ruthless, secured his throne and provided the stability needed for his peaceful and prosperous reign. With his rivals eliminated and his throne secure, Solomon's reign was poised to enter a new phase of peace and prosperity. The political purges, while brutal, had provided the young king with the necessary stability to focus on governance and nation-building. This period began with a pilgrimage to the high place at Gibeon, the most prominent sanctuary of the time, where Solomon went to offer 1,000 burnt offerings. This act was not merely a religious ritual, but a public display of piety, a demonstration to the nation that the new king would rule with a commitment to divine law, a stark contrast to the failures of his predecessor, Saul. It was at Gibeon that Solomon experienced a pivotal divine encounter, a dream in which the divine appeared to him and offered him a single wish. This was a critical test of Solomon's character and his priorities as a ruler. The choices available to him in that moment were vast. He could have asked for long life, for immense wealth, or for the military power to defeat his enemies. These were the typical aspirations of a king in the ancient world, and a request for any of them would have been understandable. However, Solomon's response was a profound and unexpected demonstration of his commitment to his role as a just ruler. Solomon's request was not for personal gain, but for the welfare of his people. He asked for a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. This was a request for wisdom and justice, the two qualities most essential for a king who was to rule a great nation. He acknowledged the magnitude of his task and his own youth and inexperience, demonstrating a humility that resonated with the people and, according to the narrative, with the divine. The response to this humble request was a divine affirmation of Solomon's choice. The narrative states that because Solomon had not asked for personal gain but for the capacity to govern justly, he would be granted not only wisdom but also the very things he had not asked for: great wealth, honor, and a long life, provided he remained obedient. This divine promise served as the moral and theological foundation for the rest of Solomon's reign. It established his reputation for wisdom and justice from the very beginning of his rule, a reputation that would be cemented in the minds of the people and neighboring nations. This reputation for wisdom was not just a personal attribute, it was a political asset that allowed him to mediate disputes, administer his kingdom effectively, and become a renowned and respected monarch throughout the region. The reputation for wisdom that Solomon had gained through his divine encounter at Gibeon was not just a theoretical concept, it was a practical attribute that he would need to demonstrate publicly. The historical narrative of his reign provides a vivid and dramatic example of this wisdom in action, a legal case that would cement his reputation as a just and discerning ruler in the eyes of the people. This was not a military victory or a political triumph, but a judicial pronouncement that required profound insight into human nature. The case brought before the king involved two women, both prostitutes, who lived in the same house and had each recently given birth to a son. In a tragic turn of events, one of the babies died in the night after his mother accidentally rolled over on him. The mother of the deceased child then, in an act of desperation, swapped her dead son for the living one, claiming it as her own. The true mother, upon discovering the switch in the morning, brought the case before the king, seeking justice. This was not a simple dispute over property, but a case that dealt with the most fundamental bonds of life and motherhood. Without witnesses or physical evidence, the king was faced with an unsolvable legal dilemma. Solomon, rather than relying on traditional legal procedures, devised a shocking and dramatic ruse to expose the truth. He listened to the claims of both women, who each insisted that the living child was hers and the dead child belonged to the other. With no way to determine the truth from their testimony, Solomon made a seemingly absurd pronouncement. He ordered his guards to bring a sword and divide the living child in half, giving one portion to each woman. The king's command was not an act of cruelty, but a psychological test designed to reveal the true heart of a mother. The effect of the command was immediate and profound. The true mother, horrified at the prospect of her child's death, cried out for the child to be given to the other woman, preferring to see him live with someone else than to see him die. The false mother, by contrast, agreed with the king's proposal, a cold and calculating response that revealed her lack of true maternal affection. Solomon, observing the woman's reactions, was able to discern the truth. He declared the woman who was willing to give up the child to be the true mother, and ordered the child to be given to her. This act of justice was not only a brilliant legal solution, but a public demonstration of a wisdom that extended beyond legal precedent to an understanding of the deepest human emotions. The news of the judgment spread throughout the kingdom, and the people saw in Solomon not just a powerful king, but a divinely inspired ruler whose judgments were based on an unassailable sense of justice. With his reputation for wisdom and justice firmly established, Solomon's reign moved into a period of unprecedented national development and ambition. The most significant project of this era was the construction of a permanent temple in Jerusalem, a grand stone structure to house the Ark of the Covenant. This project was not merely a royal building initiative. It was a fulfillment of David's earlier desire to build a house for God and a physical manifestation of the theological and political unity that defined the new kingdom. For Solomon, this was a project of immense national and personal importance, a central part of his legacy that would cement Jerusalem's status as the religious capital of the nation. The scale of the project was immense and required vast resources and meticulous logistical planning. The kingdom, while wealthy from David's wars of conquest, lacked both the raw materials and the specialized expertise needed for such a monumental undertaking. To overcome these limitations, Solomon initiated a series of strategic alliances and commercial agreements with neighboring kingdoms, most notably with Hiram, the king of Tyre. Hiram, who controlled a prosperous maritime empire, provided the skilled Phoenician artisans and craftsmen needed for the sophisticated construction. The primary raw material, cedar and juniper wood, was not available in Israel and had to be sourced from the forests of Lebanon. This required an enormous labor force to fell and transport the trees to the coast, where they were floated down to the port of Joppa and then carried overland to Jerusalem. The project also required a massive national labor force. Solomon instituted a system of compulsory labor, with 30,000 men working in rotations of 1 month in Lebanon and 2 months at home, a form of conscription that ensured the project's continued progress. This labor force, along with 70,000 men who served as porters and 80,000 men who quarried stone in the hills, demonstrated Solomon's capacity for large-scale social organization. The stone was cut and prepared in the quarries before being transported to the temple site. A logistical marvel that ensured the sound of hammering and cutting was not heard at the building site itself, a detail that emphasized the sanctity of the project. The temple was to be a highly symbolic structure built according to precise, divinely inspired plans. The central feature was the inner sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, a windowless, cubic chamber designed to house the Ark of the Covenant. This inner room was a place of profound sanctity, a symbolic dwelling place for the divine presence. The outer sanctuary, the holy place, was designed for priestly rituals and was a space of great beauty and symbolic significance. The temple's construction was a testament to Solomon's power and a crucial step in transitioning Israelite worship from a portable tent to a permanent grand religious center. The completion of the temple's grand design required not only immense logistical planning, but also a level of artistry and engineering expertise that was new to Israelite culture. Solomon's strategic alliance with King Hiram of Tyre provided the kingdom with the necessary foreign craftsmen and resources to bring the project to life. The temple was to be a highly symbolic structure, and its intricate details, from the architectural features to the ritual implements, were designed to reflect a complex theological and cosmic order. The construction was not just a matter of building, but a process of creating a physical space that was a microcosm of the divine presence. The interior of the temple was a space of unparalleled luxury and symbolic richness. The walls and ceilings were lined with imported cedar wood, which was then carved with intricate reliefs of cherubim, palm trees, and flowers. The entire interior was overlaid with pure gold, from the floor to the ceiling, creating an awe-inspiring, luminous environment. The two sanctuaries, the Holy of Holies and the Holy Place, were separated by a veil and a set of folding doors, both of which were also overlaid with gold. The Holy of Holies, the most sacred space, housed the Ark of the Covenant, which was now flanked by two massive cherubim made of olive wood and overlaid with gold, their wings outstretched to form a canopy over the ark. The exterior of the temple was just as magnificent and symbolic. The entrance was flanked by two enormous freestanding bronze pillars, which were named Jachin and Boaz. These pillars were not structural but symbolic, standing as monumental markers of the divine presence. They were cast by a master craftsman from Tyre and were adorned with intricate bronze capitals featuring lilywork and pomegranates, symbols of life and fertility. These pillars, each over 27 feet tall, were a powerful statement of the kingdom's wealth and the divine's grandeur. The temple's courtyard also featured a number of massive bronze ritual objects. The most prominent was the Sea of Bronze, an enormous cast bronze basin resting on 12 bronze oxen, 3 facing each of the cardinal directions. This basin, which held thousands of gallons of water, was a symbol of the cosmic ocean and was used by the priests for ritual purification. In addition, 10 smaller bronze basins, each on a wheeled stand, were used for washing the sacrificial animals. These ritual objects were a testament to the engineering and metallurgical expertise of the foreign craftsmen and the immense wealth that Solomon had at his disposal. The completion of the temple, with its incredible artistry and symbolic richness, was a final act of national consolidation. It provided the unified kingdom with a permanent sacred center that was a testament to the glory of the divine and the power of the monarchy. With the temple's completion and the political purges behind him, Solomon's reign entered a new phase characterized not by military conquest, but by unprecedented economic prosperity and diplomatic influence. The empire that David had built through the sword, Solomon expanded and secured through trade and strategic alliances. His reign marked a shift in national priorities from military expansion to commercial and diplomatic dominance, a period of wealth and influence that was remembered for generations as a golden age. Solomon's economic strategy was rooted in a sophisticated understanding of geopolitics. He controlled a vast territory that spanned the primary land routes connecting Egypt and the Arabian Peninsula with the great empires of Mesopotamia and Anatolia. This gave him a monopoly on a number of key trade arteries, allowing him to impose tolls and taxes on goods passing through his kingdom. This revenue stream, combined with the tribute extracted from his vassal states, provided an immense source of wealth for the monarchy and funded his massive building projects. He also forged a vast network of international trade partnerships. His most significant commercial relationship was with King Hiram of Tyre, a partnership that had its roots in the temple's construction. Through this alliance, Solomon gained access to Hiram's extensive maritime trade network, which extended across the Mediterranean Sea. The two kings collaborated on naval expeditions, with Israelite sailors learning from the Phoenician masters of the sea. These expeditions brought back exotic goods such as gold, silver, ivory, spices, and precious woods from distant lands, a source of wealth that filled the royal treasury and the markets of Jerusalem. Solomon's diplomatic alliances were just as critical as his commercial ones. He sealed many of these alliances with strategic marriages to foreign princesses, a common practice in ancient Near Eastern diplomacy. These alliances provided the kingdom with security, a network of friendly nations, and access to new technologies and resources. The most notable of these alliances was with Egypt, the greatest power of the ancient world. Solomon married an Egyptian princess, a political maneuver that brought the two kingdoms into a period of peace and mutual respect. This alliance, in turn, gave Solomon's merchants access to the lucrative markets of the Nile. The cumulative effect of these commercial and diplomatic policies was a period of incredible wealth and influence. Jerusalem was transformed from a fortified city into a bustling economic hub. The kingdom had an abundance of gold, silver, and other luxury goods. This prosperity, combined with a period of sustained peace, allowed for an explosion of cultural and intellectual activity. Solomon's court became a center of learning, attracting scholars and artists from across the known world. And his reputation for wisdom and wealth spread far beyond the borders of his kingdom. The fame of Solomon's wisdom and the prosperity of his kingdom, fueled by his mastery of commerce and diplomacy, spread far beyond the borders of his empire. This reputation, amplified by the stories of merchants and travelers, eventually reached the ears of the Queen of Sheba, a powerful monarch who ruled a kingdom in the Arabian Peninsula. Her arrival in Jerusalem was not a casual visit, but a major diplomatic and commercial event, a moment that demonstrated the true extent of Solomon's international prestige and cemented the kingdom's position as a major geopolitical power. The Queen's journey was a monumental undertaking, travelling with a large and impressive caravan of camels laden with vast quantities of spices, gold, and precious stones. This immense tribute was not just a diplomatic gift. It was a physical testament to the wealth and commercial power of her own kingdom, a demonstration that she was coming as an equal, not as a vassal. Her purpose in visiting Solomon was twofold: to test his renowned wisdom with a series of riddles and difficult questions, and to forge a strategic alliance that would benefit both of their empires. The narrative of their meeting is a testament to Solomon's reputation for profound insight. The Queen presented him with a series of intellectual challenges, a tradition of royal courts in the ancient Near East designed to test a ruler's intellectual capacity. Solomon, according to the accounts, was able to answer all of her questions and solve all of her riddles, a feat that left the Queen deeply impressed. This exchange was more than just a battle of wits. It was a diplomatic negotiation conducted on a high intellectual level. Solomon's ability to engage with her on this level demonstrated that his wisdom was not just a local phenomenon, but a universal attribute that transcended cultural and political boundaries. The Queen was also deeply impressed by the splendor of Solomon's court and the organization of his kingdom. The grandeur of the temple, the architecture of the royal palace, the order of his administration, and the efficiency of his servants all demonstrated a level of wealth and sophistication that surpassed her expectations. She remarked that the reality of his kingdom was far greater than the rumors she had heard. This validation from a powerful and independent foreign monarch was a crucial moment for Solomon. It confirmed his legitimacy and prestige on an international stage, solidifying his reputation as the wisest and wealthiest king of his era. The Queen's visit resulted in a powerful alliance between the two kingdoms. Their two empires, both positioned at a strategic crossroads of commerce, were able to forge a lucrative trade partnership. She returned to her kingdom with not only a deeper respect for Solomon, but also a wealth of goods and wisdom, leaving behind a legacy of trade and diplomacy that would further enrich both of their nations. Solomon's reign, which began with a divine gift of wisdom and was characterized by unprecedented peace and prosperity, ended with a period of moral decline and spiritual apostasy that would sow the seeds of the kingdom's destruction. The same diplomatic alliances that had brought the kingdom immense wealth and international prestige would, in his later years, become a source of profound internal corruption. The narrative of this period is a stark reminder that a king's personal choices have direct and devastating consequences for the stability of his nation. Solomon's vast network of diplomatic marriages, a common practice for securing peace in the ancient Near East, led him to take a great number of foreign wives and concubines. These women were not merely political assets. They brought with them their own cultural and religious traditions. While the narrative does not suggest that Solomon abandoned his worship of Yahweh, it is explicit that he allowed his foreign wives to practice their own religions, and, more critically, that he built shrines and high places for their gods. He is said to have built sanctuaries for gods such as Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Molech, the god of the Ammonites, and Chemosh, the god of the Moabites. This toleration of foreign worship was a direct violation of the core tenets of the Israelite covenant, which demanded exclusive loyalty to Yahweh and the complete eradication of foreign religious practices. This religious apostasy was a major political and theological problem. It was not a hidden sin, but a public and systematic subversion of the very laws that Solomon, as a king, was meant to uphold. This was a profound act of hypocrisy. From a king who had built a magnificent temple to house the Ark of the Covenant. The presence of these foreign cults and their open worship within the kingdom, in direct competition with the temple in Jerusalem, created a crisis of national identity and a fracture in the religious unity that David had so painstakingly built. The consequences of Solomon's actions were not just theological, they were also profoundly political. The narrative states that this religious decline led to divine displeasure, which would manifest in a series of external and internal threats to the kingdom. To the south, a rival rose in Edom, while to the north, a renegade military leader named Rezon established a kingdom in Damascus and began to harass Israel's borders. Internally, a discontented official named Jeroboam, who had been a supervisor of forced labor, began to conspire against the king, gathering a faction of dissidents who were angered by Solomon's heavy-handed policies and high taxes. This period of moral decline and external threat marked the end of the kingdom's golden age and set the stage for the dramatic and tragic division of the monarchy that would follow Solomon's death. Solomon's reign, which began as a golden age of wisdom and prosperity, concluded with a period of growing discontent and prophetic warnings that signaled the inevitable fragmentation of the kingdom. The same policies that had initially fueled the nation's wealthy, ambitious building projects and the vast network of international alliances now became sources of profound internal friction. This era marked a dramatic shift from national unity to a deep-seated political and social unrest, which would ultimately lead to the end of the united monarchy. The primary source of internal discontent was Solomon's heavy-handed and economically burdensome policies. His massive building projects, including the temple and his own opulent palace, required an immense labor force and an equally immense financial commitment. To fund these projects, Solomon instituted a system of compulsory labor, or corvée, which conscripted citizens from the various tribes into forced labor battalions. This policy, which was a source of great resentment, was administered unevenly, with the northern tribes bearing a disproportionate share of the burden. This created a political and economic schism between the north and south, a division that had been temporarily healed by David's rule, but was now re-emerging with renewed intensity. Simultaneously, the enormous cost of the monarchy's administrative and military structures, combined with the tribute extracted from vassal states, necessitated a high level of taxation. These taxes placed a heavy burden on the common people, who were forced to support a royal court that was increasingly perceived as extravagant and self-serving. The social contract which had bound the tribes to the monarchy was beginning to fray, as the people felt that the king's personal glory was being built on their backs. This political and economic discontent was inextricably linked with the religious apostasy of Solomon's later years. The toleration and promotion of foreign cults, in direct competition with the temple, created a crisis of national identity and a profound sense of spiritual hypocrisy. The prophets, acting as the moral conscience of the nation, began to warn of the consequences of this spiritual decline. The prophet Ahijah, in a dramatic symbolic act, tore a new garment into 12 pieces, giving 10 of them to Jeroboam, a young and ambitious official. This act was a powerful prophetic warning that the kingdom would be torn apart, with 10 of the tribes given to Jeroboam. This prophetic warning was not an isolated incident. It was a reflection of the profound political and social currents that were moving beneath the surface of Solomon's rule. The discontented factions, led by figures like Jeroboam, saw in the king's moral and political failings an opportunity to challenge the very foundations of the Davidic dynasty. The kingdom, which had reached its zenith under Solomon, was now a tinderbox of unrest, ready to ignite upon the death of the king. The sunset of a golden age was not a sudden event, but a slow and tragic decline, a period of political and spiritual decay that set the stage for the dramatic and tragic division of the monarchy that would follow Solomon's death. Israel was never the same again.